Now, trade unions have welcomed the move to include domestic workers in the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act. The new amendments call for a change to the definition of employee, as it previously excluded domestic employees. Joining me right now is Myrtle Witbooi from the South African Domestic Service and Allied Workers Union. Myrtle, a very good morning to you. Thank you for your time this morning. What is your reaction to the news of this compensation for domestic workers?
Yes, I think it is great news that has been released, but the problem is just that we've been struggling from the year 2003 to get quota for domestic workers. However, in the last cabinet meeting, it was now said that the clause will be changed to include domestic workers. But the problem is that even if that clause is now included, it will take maybe a year to really get compensation to domestic workers. And we have asked that domestic workers, it should be backdated so that it includes domestic workers that has already lost jobs and that the families were suffering, so they will also benefit from this. So this is the thing that we're waiting now on the Constitutional Court to say, will it be backdated? Or will it just start on the day that the president signed this? So it's still a concern, and you must also understand now with COVID-19, it adds to the compensation, it adds to job losses and injuries at work.
Now, as we assess the merit of this Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act to include domestic workers, what are the wins here? What is the excitement about as we reflect on some of the benefits of this inclusion?
I think that, sometimes domestic workers work in an environment where the homes is unsafe. Domestic workers work with objects. Domestic workers work with electrical things, which means that if a domestic worker hurt herself at home, that she should be compensated if she's off for 2 months or 3 months from work. The problem that we're also going to face is that a domestic worker are working alone at home. And domestic workers are isolated from other workers. So the problem is going to be, how is the domestic worker actually going to prove, and how will the domestic worker be able to, the employer believe the domestic worker? So there's a lot of education that have to be done. There's a lot of things that have to be done, because in actual fact, does domestic workers really understand what will quota mean for us? Yes, it will be great, but we need to have labor inspectors, and we need to have a lot of education for domestic workers so that we don't mess up like we mess up with the unemployment fund. Domestic workers are still struggling to get unemployment fund, many domestic workers. So we hope that this will be a benefit for domestic workers, and we also hope that employers will see that they have a fair home that is safe. And also the other step is, will domestic workers be protected traveling from their home to their workplaces? What will be the protection from them in their 2 hours or 3 hours traveling to work?
And as we go through the challenges and we go through the benefits of this act, what are the loopholes that still need to be urgently addressed as we look at other aspects of the domestic work industry when it comes to ensuring the safety, the protection and the long-term protection of domestic workers in the long term?
Yes, I think that in the long term it will provide protection for domestic workers, but it will only provide protection in the long term if domestic workers and employers are aware of the Compensation Act, and also if domestic workers are aware about the household that they're working at and how, if they get hurt, and if. But the problem could also be that many employers have not registered domestic workers for the unemployment fund. So how are we going to ensure that employers will now, benefit, or employers will now register domestic workers for this fund, the compensation fund? Because as you know, the Labour Department are always saying we don't have enough inspectors because domestic workers work at individual homes. But we are hopeful that in the long run, domestic workers will be protected and domestic workers will benefit for injuries at work, and that if a domestic worker should lose their life, that their family will benefit.
And Myrtle, before we let you go, you speak about a very important aspect of spreading the information about this act and the benefits, that it's really no use if employers don't register their employees for UIF. What are you doing then to communicate this information and spread it as a union?
Yes, I think that, the problem is, like we always say, that knowledge is still in the hand of the bosses, because the bosses have access to labor laws, the bosses have access to internet, the bosses have access to technology. So many domestic workers are always left out. And I'm sure you are aware of now with the COVID-19 how domestic workers was left out. So I think a lot of education have to take place. More inspectors should be employed to visit workplaces of domestic workers. Only in that way we will be able to ensure that domestic workers will understand and they will benefit. I think the time has come for domestic workers to stand up as women and to really understand their rights and to speak up. And only that way, if they can face their employer and say, I know my rights, and why didn't you register me, or why don't you play into this fund, then only I think we will really be truly workers that understand.
Thank you very much for your time. That reaction coming from the South African Domestic Service and Allied Workers Union's Myrtle Witbooi, giving us a sense of the impact of the compensation for domestic workers, which has finally been approved.